Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something that makes a lot of people, well, anxious. The fear of bees. You know that feeling, right?
Yeah.
That jump when you hear that buzz nearby. Lots of us feel that. So our mission today is to really unpack this fear. It's known scientifically as apiophobia.
Or sometimes apiphobia or even melissophobia.
Right, multiple names. We want to explore what's behind this unease around these, frankly, vital little creatures.
Yeah, it's telling, isn't it, that it has so many names, shows how common it is. Apiophobia comes from the Latin apiorpus for bee.
And melissophobia.
That's from the Greek melissa, also meaning bee. And then apio, of course, the fear part. And the DSM-5, the Manual for Mental Health Conditions, classifies it. It's an animal type specific phobia.
So it sits under the bigger umbrella of entomophobia.
Exactly, the fear of insects generally. And you'll see as we talk, it's often really tangled up with the fear of wasps, too.
Okay, let's get into that. The sting. That
Yeah.
seems central, right?
Absolutely central. Our sources really hammer this home. The fear of being stung is probably the primary driver for most people with apiophobia.
Makes sense. That sharp, sudden pain, it's
Mm.
a pretty basic worry. But what else is feeding into it?
Well, like you said, the sting is key. And personal experience plays a huge role if you've been stung before, especially if it was a bad experience.
Or even saw someone else get stunned badly?
Exactly. That can really cement the fear. It's learning, right? Either direct or just by watching.
Okay, but here's something I found really interesting in the material. It suggests people who haven't been stung might actually overestimate the danger. Like the unknown is almost worse. Why is that?
That's a great point. Without that real world experience, your imagination can kind of run wild. You might rely on stories you've heard, maybe dramatic stuff in movies or the news.
Or just a general squeamishness about bugs?
Right. And all that builds up the idea of the sting, the anticipation, until it feels much scarier than the reality might actually be. And it's not always just the sting itself people fear. For some, just the sound.
The buzzing.
Yeah, that buzzing noise alone can be enough to trigger that fear response.
You mentioned the wasp connection earlier. It feels like bees have a bit of a PR advantage, generally speaking.
They do, yeah. We tend to view bees more favorably because we know, or we're told, how important they are as pollinators.
Yeah.
They have this positive ecological image.
What the love?
That's the problem, those black and yellow stripes. Nature's warning sign, sure, but both bees and wasps often share it.
Leading to mistaken identity.
Precisely. And that confusion really hurts the bee's reputation.
Because wasps, fairly or unfairly, are often seen as more aggressive, more likely to sting, without much provocation.
Exactly. So bees get lumped in visually, and that negative association, that expectation of aggression gets transferred onto them, even if, a honeybee just wants to check out your picnic.
So, okay, being cautious around anything that can sting is one thing. Seems sensible. But apiophobia is specifically called an irrational fear. That distinction feels important, especially when you think about people with severe allergies.
It's a critical difference, absolutely. For someone with anaphylaxis, a life-threatening allergy to bee stings, their fear is completely rational. It's a survival instinct.
It's life-saving, potentially.
Right. But apiophobia is characterized by this persistent, excessive fear that's really out of proportion to the actual danger posed by most bees in most situations. It's a fear that significantly impacts daily life, even when the chances of getting stung are actually pretty low.
It's interesting. Spiders often come up as the classic phobia, right? But the sources suggest we're actually more likely to run into bees day to day.
That's true. Several things contribute to that. Honeybees, for instance, can gather in swarms.
Which looks terrifying, even if they aren't aggressive then.
Exactly. And it's important to stress, they usually aren't aggressive when swarming. They're just moving house, basically. But also, individual bees are drawn to our food, our sugary drinks, especially when we eat outside. So that just increases the odds of an encounter.
And those swarms,
Yeah.
even knowing they're probably not after you, just the sheer sight and sound of thousands of buzzing insects.
It can be incredibly overwhelming. Pure sensory overload for someone with the phobia, definitely panic-inducing.
The sources also brought up the whole killer bee story.
Yeah.
That narrative has definitely lodged itself in popular culture.
It has, and there's a grain of truth behind it, which makes it more potent. We're talking about Africanized bees. They're a hybrid, actually, of the Western honeybee we know and an East African subspecies. And they do tend to be more easily provoked. They defend their nests much more aggressively, chase intruders further.
And pop culture just ran with that, didn't it? Often in a really sensationalized way.
Yeah.
You can picture the movie posters.
Oh, absolutely. And that kind of portrayal, that sensationalism, it really amplifies existing anxieties. It creates this distorted picture where all bees seem dangerous, even though most species aren't aggressive at all.
The source material also hinted at something, maybe a bit more complex, that the fear around Africanized bees, particularly in the U.S., might have had undertones of xenophobia, framing them as like an invasive foreign other.
Yeah, that's a perspective raised in the sources, this idea of them being an outside threat. And their nicknames certainly play into that fear. Killer bees in North America, abejas bravas, fierce bees in South America. Those names don't exactly inspire calm, do they?
No, they don't. It seems like knowledge, or maybe the lack of it, is a big factor here too. The information suggests people who are afraid of bees often know less about them. Is that right?
Generally, yes. There seems to be a correlation. People with apiophobia tend to overestimate how likely a bee is to become aggressive or to sting. They might misinterpret normal foraging behavior as threatening.
Why does that knowledge gap seem to fuel the phobia so much?
Well, fear often grows in the dark, you know. In the absence of good information, if you don't understand bee behavior, what actually triggers them, when they sting, when they're just, doing their job, it's easy to see threats everywhere. And that lack of understanding leads to more anxiety, more avoidance.
Which stops you learning anything that might challenge the fear.
Exactly. It's a cycle.
But maybe bumblebees get off a bit lighter. They seem fuzzier, cuter.
That's a really interesting point. Perception matters. Bumblebees, even though they can sting, are often seen as less threatening. Maybe it's their round shape, their generally more bumbling flight. They seem less weaponized.
Less intimidating.
Right. It shows how our subjective view of an insect's appearance or perceived behavior can really shape our emotional reaction, even if the actual sting potential is similar to other bees.
And it's key to remember this isn't usually innate, right? Fearing a sting is something we learn.
Definitely learned, not instinctive.
And often starts in childhood. How does that typically happen?
Several ways. A direct bad experience, like getting stung as a kid, is a big one. Or observational learning, seeing a parent or someone important freak out around bees. That teaches a child these are dangerous. Media portrayals, scary stories, they all contribute to building that learned association between bees and danger.
So what does this look like in real life?
Yeah.
The impact of the phobia. It's not just being a bit jumpy, is it?
No, it can be quite debilitating. The sources really highlight how it can severely limit people's lives. Avoiding outdoor activities is common. Parks, gardens, picnics, barbecues, anything outside can feel threatening.
Constant vigilance.
Yeah.
Always scanning for bees.
Yes, hypervigilance is typical. And misidentifying other insects, flies, hoverflies, as bees, which keeps the anxiety high. Panic attacks are also common when encountering a bee, with a really strong urge to just flee the situation.
And ironically, trying to swat them away in panic.
Can actually increase the risk of being stung. It's perceived as an attack by the bee, so it defends itself, creating this awful feedback loop where the fear seems justified by the outcome.
It's that classic fear avoidance cycle you mentioned.
Oh, absolutely.
And the fear can even spread, like becoming afraid of flowers because bees are attracted to them.
That shows how pervasive it can get. The avoidance extends beyond the bee itself to anything associated with bees. It really shrinks your world, limiting access to nature, social events.
Is there treatment for this?
Yes, thankfully. Exposure therapy is often very effective for specific phobias, like apiophobia. It involves gradual, controlled exposure to the feared stimulus bees, in this case in a safe environment, to help rewire that fear response.
Okay, stepping back to the bigger picture. This widespread fear, does it have knock-on effects? For conservation, maybe?
It definitely can. Negative public attitudes driven by fear can create real barriers for bee conservation. If people are scared of bees, they might be less supportive of initiatives to protect them, like planting bee-friendly flowers or reducing pesticides.
Or even push back against things like urban beekeeping.
Exactly. Fear can lead to tighter regulations or outright bans on beekeeping in some areas, which impacts pollination locally and, the beekeepers themselves. It's a situation where misunderstanding and exaggerated fear can unintentionally harm these crucial insects.
Speaking of beekeepers, that must be a unique situation, dealing with the potential for stings constantly.
It is. The sources mention that beekeepers often have to confront and manage their own fear, or at least respect for stings as part of the job.
How do they manage that?
Well, experience helps. Over time, many develop coping strategies. They learn to read the bees, understand their moods, know when they're likely to be defensive. Protective gear obviously plays a massive role in reducing anxiety.
Sure.
But for some, there might always be a level of apprehension. It's about accepting that stings can happen, but weighing that against the benefits and rewards of keeping bees.
It's fascinating, too, that honey companies sometimes downplay bee imagery.
Isn't it? You'd think they'd lean into it, but it shows how powerful that public aversion can be. They might worry about triggering negative reactions in consumers.
Okay, slight tangent, but the sources mentioned something amazing. African elephants. They're afraid of bees, too.
Yeah, isn't that incredible? It's not just folklore. Observations confirm it, and it's actually being used practically. Beehives are being explored, even used as a sort of natural fence to deter elephants from raiding crops or damaging trees.
Wow. So the fear of the sting is potent across species. What does that tell us?
It really underscores how effective the sting is as a defense, and maybe how deeply ingrained the aversion to that kind of pain is in the animal kingdom. The fact that tiny bees can deter massive elephants really speaks volumes about the perceived impact of those stings.
It's amazing. Elephants wary of something so small. What about historically in human cultures? Has it always been fear or mixed feelings?
It's been quite varied, actually, looking back. In some African folklore, yeah, swarms could be seen as bad omens, linked to misfortune or even witchcraft sometimes. But other times, they represented good things like prosperity.
Okay, so not always negative.
No, and in ancient China, initially there was fear stings meant bad luck. But then with beekeeping,
Understanding grew.
exactly, the perception shifted. Bees became symbols of hard work, community, order, even nobility within Confucianism. They gained respect.
Interesting. And language reflects this too.
Sometimes, yes. The sources mention that in some Celtic languages, Breton, Cornish, Welsh, the actual word for bee has roots connected to the idea of stinging. So that defense mechanism has clearly been part of our awareness for a long time.
That connection is really embedded. Now, fast forward to today, you look at the news, it feels like mixed messages. We hear, save the bees, but also headlines about rare but fatal sting incidents.
That's a really important tension. Media coverage is doing two things at once, raising crucial awareness about bee decline and their importance, which is vital for conservation.
Right.
But stories focusing on those tragic, those statistically rare, sting-related deaths can tap right back into those primal fears, potentially undermining the conservation message for some people. You understand intellectually they're important, but emotionally the fear response is still strong.
And the sources mentioned the panic around Africanized bees spreading in the U.S. from the 70s, exploited in films like The Swarm.
Right, that shows how easily public anxiety about bees can be stirred up and frankly sensationalized by media and popular culture. It feeds the fear cycle.
So wrapping this deep dive up, it feels like apiophobia, this fear of bees, it's pretty significant. It's tangled up with the sting, obviously, but also a lot of misunderstanding.
Definitely. Misperceptions about bee behavior, that confusion with wasps. It all plays a part.
And crucially, distinguishing that rational fear, like with an allergy.
From the irrational phobia that can really dominate someone's life and limit their experiences, that distinction is key.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to take away. We know bees are absolutely critical for our ecosystems, for our food supply, just essential. So how might really digging in, cultivating a deeper understanding of these creatures, how might that help? Could it chip away at some of that unwarranted fear? And maybe, just maybe, help us foster a greater appreciation for everything they do for us? Definitely something worth thinking about.